This year, we organized our Backstage series around our anniversaries, ending with the number one. We talked about Balocco, we talked about Fangio, whose birthday date ended with one. We talked about Iano, and now, today, we talk about the car that we are really celebrating this year, the Alfasud. Both because, and not only because most of you are owners of an Alfasud, but because it represented a milestone for Alfa Romeo. But before starting with our backstage, we would like to show you an excerpt of a long and interesting interview that Luigi Cecconi of the Alfa Sud Club Italia did to Giorgetto Giugiaro on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of this car. I think that it is very curious to know how it was born. Mr. Ruska, the engineer, Austrian engineer who had an incredible career, met Bertone, but he went everywhere basically, but he was charged to build this plant with the project of Alfa Sud. So, knowing him and Mantovani, of course, we received a call saying, okay, I want to talk to you. Where? In a bar at the outskirts of the city, close to the stadium. It was bizarre. We sat down for aperitif. He had a notebook with squares, and he said, I have to do a project. So he started sketching the engine, the pedals. I remember it very well. And then there was the 124 Fiat. Then he wanted certain length, certain measures. So my colleague said, in which plant? And he said, no, there's nothing. There's nothing existing yet. Everything is still to be built. So he starts with a sketch. So, total length, and it tells us to do this graphic journey that you will see later here. So, he was an engineer having an incredible culture, but especially he was one of the few who knew all the measures of the cars, but not only, he knew the measure of the side, of the windows, of the pedals. He was a monster of knowledge. And living in this world, I met very few people like him. So we start with the first sketches, and we have not one, but three polystyrene models. He comes to see these three models, and then together we decide the one which was the most fit, I would say. And we identify one of those three. Then he takes his ruler, goes close to the windows, makes the measurements, and then he said, I don't like it anymore. Oh gosh. The problem for him were measures, because measures and sizes meant weight. If it was, for example, 420 instead of 390 millimeters, that meant it had to impact on everything. So we start doing the project. So from the polystyrene model, we created this model, and simultaneously also the interior mock-up. We must think that talking about Alfasud doesn't mean talking about a car. It means talking about another chapter of the history of Alfa Romeo, of a chapter of history that has to do with corporate choices, with technical research, with new plants, new communication strategies, and a different positioning on the market. And basically, the doubling of the size of a company, which in the 20 previous years was 10 times more than the pre-war period. So we're talking about an operation that changes completely the Alfa Romeo, expands it, and gives way to a family of cars, of which we have today one of the first cars here with us today, and is part of the collection of the Museum of Alfa Romeo, and which was exposed in the museum. And it is the last Alfasud, the S-Dar, which is the embryo of the 33. And the solutions were started to be put on the car which followed the Alfasud. So let's start the storytelling from Pomigliano d'Arco, where it was built. So Pomigliano d'Arco, near Naples, was not a new place for Alfa Romeo. Since 1938, Alfa was building there a plant not for the realization of cars, at least in the beginning, but to create parts of airplanes, engines, but not only. It was the San Martino airplane plant. So the choice of Pomigliano was not only and solely a technical choice, but it was also the consequence of Italian way of political decisions to move certain industrial productions and many state-owned productions, like the Alfasud, to give life to areas which were very underdeveloped. So that was the origin of the Alfasud and Stabilimento Romantico San Martino, but it was also the spirit that allowed to Alfa itself to be born. Since the Darracq, coming from London and then from the French headquarters, had its seat in Naples, because there was a law of 1904 that was there to promote the economy of the South. So the first Darracq had its headquarters in Naples for the same reason for which the Stabilimento Aeronautico was born a few years later in 1938, and the same reason for which Prato la Serra, Alfasud, etc. were also born in those years. In the case of Alfasud, this political approach has always been questioned but never publicized. In the case of the Stabilimento Aeronautico, the airline plant, it was one of the strong points of that initiative. Once you went out of this shack hoping to gain some money. Today, you get out of this nice house, proud of your work and satisfied. These videos are part of a documentary which is 1 hour long and was produced by Alfa Romeo for the launch of the plant, the Stabilimento Aeronautico, and that was communicated not only in terms of production, war production, because Alfa Romeo was under military control since 1935, but as a way to give life to a dull area in the periphery area of Naples. And maybe you've seen also in the video that there are the terracotta bricks that Gobato ordered, 50 all different, to be placed on the facade of the buildings where the employees of the Stabilimento Aeronautico lived. 4 of those bricks were exposed today in the collection. So 4 were left in Milan and now they are showcased in the museum. What was the real pride of the Stabilimento Aeronautico went beyond production. The Pomigliano plant, seen from above, had the shape of a plane. There were the pavilions, which were the wings, and then there were buildings for the tail and the track as a fuselage. There were kindergartens, schools, and Alfa bought 2 fishing boats to fish the fresh food for the canteen. So Stabilimento Sarmantino was a microcosm that had to be self-sufficient and represent the idea of a model plant. Let's have a leap forward when in 1968 the plant is built. The intentions are the same. They wanted to build a modern plant that could produce 1,000 cars per day, that could be self-sufficient, as structured as it should be. But from the beginning, everyone started talking about the importance of the Alfasud plant on the area. So there were public speeches, parliamentary meetings, press conferences explaining, almost always written by Luraghi, which was the author of the project, that this plant could have positive impacts on Alfa Romeo and on the territory. So the years go by, and in Turin in 1971 the Alfasud is presented. So the ceremony of presentation to the press was held in the foyer of the Museum of the Automobile. That area is still present. It's in the atrium of the museum, and immediately after it was exposed to Torino Esposizioni, where there was the motor show. And I know that some of you yesterday went there, those who are part of the club, and you talked with Giorgetto Giugiaro. Having said so, as always with our backstages, I'm also here on behalf of the museum with other persons which we invited and that add value to this backstage. We have Danilo Moriero today connecting through Zoom with us. He's a longtime friend, responsible of Turin Motor, the association grouping all the municipalities having a connection with the world of automobile, Arese and Maranello, of course, and Pomigliano. And together with Danilo, we wanted to analyze the origin of Alfasud, the protagonists of Alfasud, and the role of Alfasud in the history of Alfa Romeo. Danilo, we know that you also have material to show us, but first of all, let's talk about the Alfasud project and what it represented. Yes, first of all, good evening, everyone. And thank you, Lorenzo, for inviting me. Talking about Alfasud gives the occasion, especially to an audience of fans, to shatter some myths. And you said it very well before. Luraghi was the author of the Alfasud project. What was the myth that was built over time? of the myth of a car which was stepsister of Alfa Nord, sort of technical byproducts that had to be born just for political reasons. This is the first thing that now we have to clarify. That was not the case. Luraghi was the father of Alfasud. Giuseppe Luraghi was a Milanese manager but also a writer, and after leaving the company he also directed publishing houses. So he was a personality with a political point of view, and whose idea was that you had to bring work to the south of Italy, but also an advantage to the company. We should not forget something, as a matter of fact. Alfa Romeo never sold a lot of cars. Well, one of the biggest successes before Alfasud was the Giulietta, who made Luraghi famous, but the volumes were not high. The managers of Alfa, not only Luraghi but also the Liri and Rusca, wanted to sell a lot of average cars. And to try win the monopoly of Fiat. And at the time, they put their eyes on the Pomigliano plant, which already existed since the 30s, but in the history of Erie, which came out a few years ago, well, in those researches, important documents were found. One of these documents is a preliminary project called Vetturetta Type V or 5, I don't know, which was the precursor of Alfasud even before the 750, which is kept by the museum. So, a small car designed by Rusca, and in the papers that were found in the Liri archive, it's written study for production in Naples, and their characteristics are extraordinary. 400 cc's, 2 boxer cylinders, 17 power horses, 90 kilometers per hour, price 480,000 lira. So the car had to cost 1,000 liras per kilo. That was the ratio to sell an average car. It was 1951. So at the time, they were thinking about a small car to be produced in Naples, and that meant Pomigliano, of course. So, a project fully embedded in the ideas of the Alfa Romeo management, in particular Luraghi, who from 51 to 56 was the general director of Finmeccanica, and always had a particular love for his creature, Alfa Romeo, and he became president of Alfa Romeo from 60 to 64. And we will also talk about something else later on. But the original project was very good. You said that some materials are present here today, and I will share them with you. It's audio recordings of interviews done in 2010 on the occasion of the 100th anniversary to 2 main characters in a different way. One is Domenico Chirico, engineer Domenico Chirico, who was head of project of Alfasud. The man who was called at a certain time at the end of the 60s to draw and bring to life this car. The other audio recording is from a lesser known person, an engineer, Achille Moroni is his name, not Guido Moroni, who was a great test driver of Alfa Romeo. Achille Moroni, in this interview that I made, tells us how it could cancel the problem of the car, which is rust. The problem that creating a negative image at the beginning of the production and the sale. And he not only eliminated the problem of rust, but, as Morone says, when we solve the problem, a certain negative aura around the car had already consolidated and it was too late. So before listening these audio recordings, I would like also to tell you an anecdote. Ruska, well, it was August or September 1967, and Ruska was in an office in the center of Milan, alone. He opens the cahier de charge, the specifications of the car, and he needed an engineer to develop this project. Somewhere else, we were still at the Portello. Orazio Sottapoliga calls Domenico Chirico and tells him, well, listen, Mr. Chirico, Mr. Ruska wants to talk to you. Go to Piazza Firenze, a square in Milan. So they met for the first time. On one side, the father of the concept of Alfasud, Ruska, and the person who would put in place that, Domenico Chirico. Domenico Chirico, who unfortunately passed away in 2017, was a relative of Filippo Surace. That is the man, the designer of the Giulia. So we can start the recording of Chirico. It was done in March 2010 for my book, Alfa Romeo, Gli anni di Arese. Of course, it's still on a tape that you shared with us, and it's very nice for the entire audience to listen to this incredible voice of the protagonist. Yes, it's a vintage interview. So I accepted to go and meet Ruska, who had an office near Piazza Firenze. And he told me that we had to create this car. But this man told me everything, but I was hesitating. Well, for him, it was something like taken for granted. And no one told me anything. I was just told, Ruska has to talk to you, but I already decided that I had to go and work for Ruska. So they already hired you? Yes, 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 without asking me. For them, I was already working on the project. And what year was that? It was 1967. Yes, 67. It was September. So he told me, next week, you start. So I was in an office near Piazza Firenze, empty, only me and Ruska, who gave me that cahier de charge, which was the specifications of the car. So the specifications of the Alfasud, and we had to go from those specifications to the creation of a car. So I don't want to spend time on this, but it was a drama to me. But in the end, everything went good. Why do you say it was a drama? Because I was alone. So you didn't live well this inclusion in this first team. But there was no one. There was no one in the team. There was just a young, an Austrian technician who Ruska met in Turin and already hired. It was very good, but we were alone. Danilo, are you there? Yes. So, this romantic audio recording, and you hear the imperfections of the old tapes which makes it very vintage. And so he describes as this casual meeting, a bizarre meeting between the great designer. Rushka was very famous. He worked for Volkswagen. He worked at important projects also for the army. And this young 39-year-old engineer who started his experience at Alfa Romeo working at trucks and articulated vehicles. And the same Kiriko himself, in another part of the interview, tells me, do you remember that movie by Gassman, the Armata Brancaleone? So after a few months by mixing the staff we had and some new hires from Alfa Nord, the Armata Brancaleone turned into a bold team who could solve all the technical problems and start this car. We should also remind that it was September 67. In the meantime, after a few months, 29th of April 1968, the first brick of the car plant of Pomigliano was placed, and the first pre-series and then the first cars of the series were produced in the first months of 1972. So those were burning times from a certain point of view. In the meanwhile, in the region of Campania, in Pomigliano and Napoli, there was a selection of the employees, but what came after that was another point. Maybe we will discuss about it later on. I mean, about the recruitment. So in the interview, I asked Kiriko, well, it was a pioneering feat, very nice, but how was this car? What do you think about this car? So there's a second part of the audio recording where Kiriko answers me and very proudly says his creature was technically very good. So, okay, first we have an excerpt talking about the Armata Brancaleone. Yes, do you remember the Armata Brancaleone? Yes, of course. So at the beginning it was the Armata Brancaleone, but then when the Armata Brancaleone was mixed with the technicians of Alfasud, but it was a perfect army that was able to design the car from A to Z. Not because it was my car, but it was an excellent car with a great front traction. And in Alfa Romeo, we didn't have experience, either I nor my test pilots had that experience. So we created a team without experience. Can we name some of the drivers? Salvo Sanesi, first of all, par excellence. Yes, he was number one, ex-Formula 1, and then we had Moroni. Yes, Moroni was the head of the pilots, then Zanardi. There were seven. The 7 knights of the apocalypse. And they had kilometers of experience on that car. But you have to consider that it's the testers, the pilots, who give the thumbs up. So it's their experience, which is then summed up to the experience of the engineers, and that is very important. So in this part, Kiriko quotes the Fantastic Seven, so the pilots who tested the Giulia, but then Alfasud also developed an internal testing school linked to the figure of Colombrino, who worked at Balocco and will become the historic pilot of Alfasud. So now I just want to give the floor back to you, Danilo. Yes, thank you, Lorenzo. As you heard, Domenico Chirico says without hesitation it was a great creature. A front engine, it was very accessible, very roomy. So one day, if we talk about the models that followed, we will also listen to the audio interview of Kiriko. This interview is very long and I think very interesting. And it talks about the Alpha 33, like a different dress of the Alfasud. And then about another particularly juicy adventure, which is the moment when Kiriko became very high in the hierarchy. It's the 70s. It was called for a secret mission. It was sent to Switzerland to buy a Nissan Sherry to be brought to Italy, where they would have to put mechanical parts of the Alfasud. And in this way, the Arna was born. But that's a different story. We will talk about this another time. What is important is to reinstate the best of the Alfa Romeo managers, from Luraghi to Rusca to Chirico, Orazio Sata, etc., worked around this project, which is the Alfa Romeo realizing the highest volumes in the history of the brand. And of course, there's a reason for that. Yes, I'm sure. After the launch, as you said, there will be a first critique. Maybe the market was not ready for Alfasud, but we talk again about the rust with your interview with Achille Moroni. Yes, the rust becomes a big problem immediately. So the problem is a problem of quality control, as it is called today. But it was also called like that at the time. So there's a common place, there's a bias that is also found on the blogs, on certain publications and conferences. So rust was on the Alfasud of the first series because that steel was a low cost, a cheap steel coming from Soviet Union. That's bullshit. Alfa Romeo didn't buy steel from the from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union. They were coming from another public plant of steel. Today it's Ilva. It's not even Ilva. It is ArcelorMittal. At the time, it was called Italsider. Another great cathedral in the desert, built in Taranto to produce steel under public control. So, engineer Achille Moroni, head of quality at the moment, it was the mid-70s, and then director of the Alfa Nord plants in the 80s. Well, engineer Achille Moroni was sent to Pomigliano to discover what was happening in those assembly lines. There was another effect, which is true. The assembly lines of the plant were subject to continuous stops for micro strikes. And then there was another devastating element, absenteeism. According to a 77 survey, the levels of absenteeism went from 18 to 24%, and that means that the lines were continually stopped. So Moroni leaves Alfa Nord, then goes to Pomigliano, stays there for several weeks, and discovers a series of problems that he tells in this interview. Yes, the Alfasud had a low resistance to corrosion, and that to us was inconceivable because we were using the same steel of the Taranto steel plant. We were using the same painted products of Alfa Romeo Nord, which didn't suffer from oxidation. So the lines on which we painted the ovens, okay, were more modern than the Alfa Romeo Varese. So this phenomenon was inconceivable. So I started to go from department to department, not only analyzing the quality of the products that were used, but also analyzing the production cycle. So I realized about some things that I cannot tell, but there were differences in electrophoresis baths with big pollution, and then I realized pollution, you mean impurity in the baths? Yes, yes, it was not perfect. There were impurities. And then I realized there were so many micro strikes stopping the lines, and with the stopping of the lines, the bodies that went out of the oven, there were dripping water, condensation water, which went on the semi-painted body, so the rust started. There were so many causes, micro causes, due to a bad management of the cycle. Yeah, you can go along. Yes, this is a direct witnessing of the person who solved the problem, and he solved the problem so well that today it is possible to see some models of the following series, those exposed in a museum and others that arrived at the museum for an event, but what represented Alfasud for the Italian state and the public industry? Well, in July 67, the Committee for Financial Planning said yes to the project. Inca was born because Alfasud was called Industria Napoletana Costruzione Automobili. That's the real name. It was a different company compared to Alfa Romeo SPA. So they put on the table 300 billion investments, and they thought producing 250,000 Alfasud per year, according to the numbers of 73, but the capacity of Pomigliano was even higher. It was done for 300,000 cars per year, but that level was never reached. So what happens? We talked about the problems of rust, but there were also serious problems on the staff, the recruitment of the staff, because at a certain point in 1971, Alfa Romeo already selected 5,000 persons according to their criteria in the area of Naples. 1971, the ministry, Carlo Donat-Cattin, Ministry for Work, imposed a directive saying that there must be provincial offices that have to recruit the people. So the conclusion is written by Augusto De Benedetti, an historian in the history of Iri. 8,000 people were hired from all areas of the Campania region without control. So it means from different areas, people left in the morning to go to Mogliano d'Arco, and that created problems, also problems of disparity, because, okay, Iri in 77 had an internal survey. There were 6,800 direct employees, so people working on the line. There were 8,260 indirect employees. It is clear that something was not going well. We already talked about absenteeism. So things started to go wrong and wrong. So, as you said during the introduction, the system of state participation, which today is considered the evil, in reality was born out of a good idea, so bringing jobs to the south. And in part, that was also successful for a certain period of time. So, in the period when the Alfasud was born, was like the last part of public industry. 10 years of planning from 73 to 72. After that, it was over. But I would like to write a couple of lines on the expectations. So Loraghi, in front of the Industry Commission in February 69, and so the project started, the car would be out a lot of time afterwards. Loraghi says to the parliamentary members, you don't have to expect that Alfasud saves the south of Italy. It's just a first step, a fresh push in a sector which has great capacity of proliferation. In reality, this was not the case, but what happened was even worse. Later on, between 73 and 74, politics invented the need of assembling 70,000 Alfa Romeo in a plant in Campania. So you will say, Pomigliano? No, it was not Pomigliano. It was the idea of a new plant to be built somewhere else, in Irpinia. It was not possible due to the opposition of Giuseppe Loraghi and a part of the managers of IRI, but to go against that project that would become the Arna plant, Loraghi in 74 was expelled from the board of directors. So there are human factors, political factors, technical factors, but there lies the history of this project. So employment in the south, industry in the south, Alpha in the south, so good ideas that then clashed with the political pressures and tensions of the moment. And we heard that some things from the voice, even though it was a crackling voice of two main characters, Chirico and Moroni. Thank you, Danilo. I will get back to you soon. But now, let's talk about the core of Backstage. Well, the Backstage was born to tell behind the scenes stories and to show objects that have never been showcased, but also to tell what we find in our archives. So the historical archive of Alfa Romeo built up over the years up to 2015 was made up of 800 meters of documents. And this morning some of you saw it. And then in 2015, after the restructuring of the museum, another cataloging work started, merging archives from Arese and other European branches. And today, the new archive went from 800 to 6,000 linear meters of documents, 6 kilometers of sheets of paper, put one after the other, with about 10,000 tubes of technical drawings, pictures, videos. So a fundamental part of this archive is the aggregated Alfasud archive. So since Alfasud was born, as Danilo was explaining, as a different company from Alfa Romeo, when the documents arrived in Arese, they were not considered as coming from a branch of the company, but as arriving from another company. So that was considered an aggregated archive that over the years merged with the archive of Alfa Romeo. This aggregated archive by itself is almost 40 meters of folders, and it's divided in two main series. And here you can see some images. One series is a series dedicated to the plant, so everything having to do with the foundation of company, building of the plant, so all the infrastructure which gave way to the separated company, but always belonging to Alfa Romeo. And the other series is called Alfasud Ruska. So in reality, it was not linked to the person of Ruska, but it means that it was the archive of the secretariat. So as we have all the secretariat of Ugo Gobato, Pasquale Gallo, so the first managers and then Luraghi, we also have that linked to the Alfasud managers. So the secretariat of a general director of a president is the body selecting all the letters, the projects, the files, passing through the hands of the manager, selects them, keeps the most important ones, and archives them. So all the decisions linked to Alfasud, at least the strategic ones, so they didn't discuss about the color, but the fundamental decisions are kept in these folders. To us, this is a mine, allowing us to show you documents that probably you never saw before, but most of all, it is a starting point of a research on Alfasud that would have enough material to go beyond the existing publications and also beyond the current knowledge of the topic. So it's really history in the history that should be told. So just taking some hints from this archive, I want to show you a few images. So one of the most interesting documents is a series of schedules, diagrams that had to explain day after day, month after month, sector after sector, how the idea had to be transformed into the finished product. So here we have a list, it's a portion of a 2-meter sheet of paper, all the planning steps that had to bring from 1968, so when the project started operationally, till 1971, when the production started. So here you can understand the idea of what had to happen, when and how. Then we have a series of documents that refer to the company, because Alfasud had to refer to the headquarters how things were going, so the advancements. So we have a report stating what time was production in February 1970, not only what point the construction was, but also the recruiting campaign, as Danilo was explained before, and also the supply contracts, because you can imagine that producing a car means, okay, building a plant, but also all a series of suppliers that can give way to this production process. And in the end, Alfa Romeo also commissioned, and did that only for Pomigliano, never for Alese, a huge photography service given to a group of art photographers. So in the same year when the Alfa Romeo produced the trophies, commissioned to Bruno Monari, Lucio Fontana, and many other artists, they thought that also life in the factory has to be told through nice images, giving the idea of what Alfasud had to be. First of all, a plant that could produce 1,000 cars per day. There are fantastic pictures that alternate to normal pictures where the activity is explained. And then there are all the folders with the speeches that Giuseppe Luraghi had to keep in front of a parliament, at the board of IRI, in front of journalists, shareholders, the public, because the Alfasud matter became every day hotter, and it was needed to report and explain, etc. And this is one of the documents where also before Danilo Monero wrote, read a couple of lines, and so they tried to respond to the critiques. And then there's another activity which goes towards the outside, so not the inside the company, but the outside. The Alfa Romeo prepares a campaign. So Alfa Romeo thinks of having to respond and answer the questions of the journalists in a very defensive way. They knew some critiques were arriving, especially on the impact and interference of politicians. And here, Giuseppe Loraghi, in a very long series of corrections of these drafts, writes a series of answers that had to be done to the journalists who could have had objections. And here he touched some of the elements that we already talked about, in particular when he is asked the very straightforward question: what is the impact of Alfasud on the employment of Naples? And Loraghi says that could be an embryo of a real reindustrialization of the area. But he also wants to underline that for Alfa Romeo, it was a condition, an essential condition to have materials and products made at competitive prices according to the state of the art of the time. So it's very defensive. It says Alfasud is an operation that was wanted by the government also to bring employment, but my priority is having a quality product, so guaranteeing that the supplies, my supplies and those of my outsourcers, are in line with the quality that we require in our project. So the plant takes off with the problems we talked about before, and a huge photographic series, and we also have a series of documents telling step by step the building of the project, and also the relationships which are not always straightforward with SIRP, the Ital design by Giorgetto Giugiaro, a company which was born to design the Alfasud and had to do on one side with the very straightforward and precise needs of Ruska, like limitations on the internal space, the luggage, etc., like they're sort of legends, but those requests are listed in the minutes of the meetings, and they originate discussions with suppliers and a series of modifications that would lead to the definition of the Alfasud with all the details and characteristics and specifications that we know. Also, the report continued, that is the most official one, the report on the Alfasud, the plant, which is recorded in the budget of 1971. So it is what Alfa Romeo and Loraghi left to its successor, and that also impacted on the success of the company Alfasud. So Alfasud was presented, and it was presented with a communication campaign aiming at making it the most Alfa Romeo as possible, very fashionable, underlying its characteristics: innovation, sporty performances, but also loyalty to the brand. Alfa Romeo is not only producing a new car, it is also integrating a very fresh communication strategy. They know they are selling a more accessible product, a cheaper product, and they try to communicate this in the best possible way. Even though the situation was not always the ideal one, but Alfa in that period, and well, even before presenting to the public the Alfasud that we all know, had high ambitions, even higher. We know Alfasud for the range we've seen. We know that Alfasud debuted as a 4-doors car, but all the official pictures are done with a 2-doors car that was born later on, the Alfasud T, more sportier. But that was a choice not to produce the Alfasud with 2 doors that was taken last minute when the official pictures had already been taken. And then we know about the several series, the Giardinetta, the Sprint. These are all versions that we know, and then we can judge for the role they had in our history. But what is not very known is that the ambitions of Alfasud, as I was telling you, were even higher. So a small crossover were considered, as well as different versions. And the Alfasud Spider was also studied. The Alfasud Spider was commissioned first place to Sirpe, detail designed by Giugiaro, and that to be a halfway between a Spider and a Targa, it had to be something very similar to the X19. So a strongly wedge car, very young, benefiting from a good mechanics like the Boxer, the Alfasud, but also at the same car show, the Alfasud Caimano was presented very low, aerodynamic, and very sporty. That was a proof of Giugiaro that the Alfasud core was very versatile, and the body could have been used for very different types of cars. That also the communication lifeline of Alfa Romeo, presenting in its standard the Alfasud Berlina, but that also kept a very sportier, much sportier version, where the critics could go, the Caimano was a dream car, of course, but it was not the case for the Alfasud Spider, because Alfasud Spider was thought, it was also built. It was built, tested, more than one prototype was built, and what from these images can look like a style prototype, mannequin, maquette, as you want to call them, which usually are built in several scales, so we can think about a resin model, clay model, or wood model. No, in reality it was a real car, running car. We have the proof on this document where you see the date April 1971. So they were thinking about static prototypes, static tests, the setup, the study of the body. By SIRP, the first road tests, versatility, etc. So Alfasud was born, as Daniele Moriero explained, was born thinking about inaugurating a new era of the automobile, of Alfa Romeo, trying to get closer, even though they never reached that figure, to 1,000 cars per day. So many projects were abandoned due to the fact that immediate success, even though 1 million cars are not negligible, but the first results would not allow the Alfa Romeo to follow all the ideas that were put on the table, so to speak. So at this point, we have a great leap forward, but we are running late. So to the last, Alfasud, the SVAR and ESVAR projects. Well, ESVAR, Energy Saving Vehicle Alfa Romeo, and SVAR, Synthesis Vehicle Alfa Romeo. The ESVAR was a prototype with a CM technology based on a 1500 of a car betting on the reduction of emissions and consumption. So the Alfasud was born in 1971, so it wasn't an old school car, but that was the year of the first ESV American conference, so the first conference on safety. And the first conference when the concept of sustainability was arrived as an avalanche to the American universe of cars and later on in Europe. And the second car, the one that you see showcased here, even though it had flaws, typical of a prototype, needed to develop a real car, is called synthesis, because apart from research on the reduction of consumption and pollution, it also bets on safety, reliability, and sustainability of the project as a whole. And it anticipates many of the technical solutions. First of all, brakes on the wheels that will go in production with the 33, which will be the direct heir of Alfasud. So the line was designed in-house, completely different, but it would be the direct heir of Alfasud. So we have here the first one, even if it is numbered 130. So it's the first, we have the first and the last Alfasud. So the beginning and the end of a story that we told today, but would require more time. But the 33 was produced and would not arrive at a production of Alfasud. It will stop a little bit before, unless we include also the Sportwagon versions. So in that case, the 33 would become the bestseller of Alfa Romeo. But after 33, other cars arrived, and as this morning Danilo suggested me, the Pomigliano d'Arco is, as of today, the most ancient plant still working, linked to the name of Alfa Romeo. So, the role of Pomigliano d'Arco in the world of Italian automobile, Danilo, is still very important. Pomigliano is still strongly connected to engines. Am I right? Yes. Pomigliano d'Arco is a city of engines. So what happens over the years? Well, the ancient pole of Alfa Romeo Avio continues to live and strengthen at the moment. Production of aeronautic parts is made in Pomigliano d'Arco. Then there is the rebuilding activity of the line of the car plant, but I have a piece of news that I'm happy to give you and to the fans of Alfasud and to Lorenzo. The current managers of Pomigliano d'Arco, well, no, actually, the current municipality of Pomigliano d'Arco has just been renewed, and the municipality is working on a museum of cars and engines, and it will be typical of that part. So it will be a mix automobile and aeronautics. That the project is already in an advanced stage. So I think that through the activity of this municipality of Pomigliano, and also in view of the association Città dei Motori, so in the framework of this association, Città dei Motori, groups of fans can go and visit that plant and what will be born in the future, that the Mayor del Mastro and the region of Campania are preparing. So Pomigliano d'Arco, it's a historical plant, the most ancient plant of Alfa Romeo. And it was always there. But Lorenzo, I have to add something else. Well, a couple of things more. One, thanks for showing us these 6 kilometers of archives of Alfa Romeo, Alfasud, where you extracted pictures and documents that I never personally had a chance to see. And then I wanted to thank you, well, for inviting me, but also because I have to remind you that in 1983, when I was around 20, my first automobile, my father bought it for me. My first automobile was an Alfasud Sprint, the 1350. It was from 79, with which I toured Italy until rust, because again, rust was present, stopped me. But I believe that in all the stories, direct and indirect stories of us, of fans or journalists of Alfa Romeo, there's a moment when we met an Alfasud. But I would like to conclude my speech by quoting the title of a book that many of us read. It's a book by Rinaldo Gianola, Luraghi, l'uomo che inventò la Giulietta, the man who invented Giulietta. So he also invented the Alfasud, so the title could be Giuseppe Luraghi, the man who invented Alfasud and was proud of it, rightfully proud of it. And I think that for reasons that were documented by historians and for reasons of passion, we have documented the story, but we can say this: Giuseppe Luraghi, the man who invented Alfasud. Thank you, Danilo, for your participation. It was very precious. I also want to thank our audience.